As voters and campaigns alike focus on immigration, what does our state's population actually look like? What's missing in the local and national narrative? We're bringing your questions to Connecticut's Integrated Refugee and Immigrant Services. But first, with reproductive health care, a possible election decider and fears when it comes to the future of women-centered policy, like much here in Connecticut, we're talking with Representative Jillian Gilchrest about conversations at the state capitol, the accomplishments she wants residents to know about so far, and how unveiling women's history can create better future legislating. That's ahead on The Real Story. Good morning and thanks for joining us here on The Real Story. I'm Emma Wulfhorst. We're talking policy issues and the priorities people are bringing to the polls, from fears surrounding immigration to gender gaps in women-centered policy like reproductive rights or gun laws, lowering domestic violence. Joining us here first is Democratic State Representative Jillian Gilchrest, House Chair of the Human Services Committee, and a leading voice when it comes to intersectional conversations and legislative policy. Representative Gilchrest, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So you've been called by many, your colleagues and residents, as a real warrior for women at the state capitol. I've seen you and I've been there at all the different committee meetings and press conferences. I want to talk big picture first. We saw a lot more laws go into effect this past week, October 1st, and we're also looking ahead to the next legislative session in the new year coming up quickly, a budget session where some proposals will come back to life and new introduced. What priorities are on the table right now? What are the conversations you're a part of when it comes, specifically here to women-centered policy in Connecticut? Because we know that's a big umbrella.
Yes, sure, and it certainly is. One of the key pieces of legislation that we were able to pass last year is to support law enforcement in their investigation techniques with victims of sexual assault. So what we found to be true, that there were a number of cases here in the state of Connecticut where a victim ended up being treated like a suspect. And that primarily was because the interview techniques that police are using are for suspects, rather than being able to interview a victim understanding trauma. So that passed. We're very happy about that, to see where that goes. Coming up in the next year, we're going to continue our work with reproductive health care, trying to ensure that folks have access to care, that they're protected. And one piece we've been seeing all across this country are when women are arriving at a hospital in an emergency state, and because of their state's laws on abortion, they're not being provided the care they need. I think many in this state think we're safe, we've done a lot to protect folks. That said, we do have some religiously affiliated hospitals in the state of Connecticut, and so we want to pass legislation that ensures that the providers at those hospitals can perform the care that they are trained to perform, and that the religious tenets of that hospital don't get in the way of that.
And I want to talk more about that. But first, you chair the House Human Services Committee, and you're very close to this budget battle that's been going on, for years now. We've seen it come up every session, even if it isn't a budget session. Nonprofits and residents see this historic state surplus, but then they're told there's not enough of the pie to share, as we have those fiscal guardrails, which many believe need to be in place to keep the state in the good financial position it's in, but at the same time kind of cause some rigidity there for how flexible the legislature can be passing out extra funds. When you're in these hearings or even in constituent meetings and you hear how bad the need is, whether it is for nonprofits or their organizations, what do you say to them? How do you communicate what's going on here, and what do you think the budget session can maybe do better next year?
So I think the conversation has to stop being all or nothing.
Right.
When it comes to the fiscal guardrails, we can make changes, and we have to make changes. We have now a look-back period, and so we can decide what has worked, what has not worked with the fiscal guardrails. We can continue to pay off our debt, but we need to invest in our future. And right now, by not investing in state services, we are causing problems that are going to go into the future for decades. We're not paying staff. A large percentage of the folks who work in the homeless space are themselves on public services. And we know that many of the services that were once available to folks in this state that they depend on are no longer available. We cannot continue to operate like this. And so we would tell someone to look at their own budget and reevaluate. We need to look at ours and reevaluate.
Do you think there's room for conversations about potentially shifting the guardrails next session, even though they were just reinstituted this past year?
I think so. I don't see why not. I don't think it has to be, nope, we made that vote, now we just move ahead. We are hearing all across the board, whether it's public education, whether it's the homeless, whether it's individuals with disabilities. There's just a whole variety of populations who are being impacted by us not adjusting the guardrails.
And when it comes to, that need getting bigger, we've seen a lot, especially post-pandemic in the state. Just this past week, you were marking the start of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. The words used by Connecticut advocates here were, brutal, relentless, a problem they say is getting much worse. Tell me a little bit more about that.
Sure, and that's directly linked because we know that when individuals are experiencing stressors in their lives, so unemployment, low wages, high housing costs, not having access to food,
right,
it can increase tensions in a household, which can lead to more domestic violence. And so it's not the be-all, end-all solution, but it is certainly contributing to it, and we need to be investing in our people to prevent these problems in the future.
And you talked at the start here about the new law and changes for how law enforcement handles those situations. Is there anything that can be done from a more, holistic approach as well for this?
Certainly. I mean, there's a lot we could be doing on the prevention side. And so we could be investing in health education K through 12. We could be investing in the services in our community for both domestic violence, sexual assault. These are individuals who go out in the community and educate. And so, again, those are the things that we see getting cut or reined in when we're not reevaluating our budget.
And with the strengthening of things like red flag laws to try and, prevent some of what unfortunately turned into deadly cases of domestic violence, Connecticut really continues to have some of the most comprehensive gun control laws in the country, and you've been part of historic steps in that arena. But because the American map of policies tends to look so different right now, depending on how many miles you travel in one direction, we've also seen some unprecedented Supreme Court repeals. There is concern about how that could impact Connecticut laws and, what's happening on a federal stage as well, with an election ahead and a lot of conversations around these different policy areas, from guns to reproductive rights. What do you tell people who might be having those concerns right now, who might think, I live in Connecticut, I feel like I have these state laws that protect me, but they might be watching what's happening either in other states or trying to happen on a federal level?
Yep, and it's overwhelming for a lot of people right now. What I tell them is be sure to know who represents you here in the state, because the only reason we have these laws in place is because legislators voted on them and the governor signed it. And so we need to ensure that we continue to elect people here at the state level who support preventing gun violence, protecting individuals' access to reproductive health care, and a whole host of other issues. When it comes to the federal government, though, this is an incredibly important election. And if Donald Trump is elected, I believe he will try to pass laws that would have an impact on our state. State law can only go so far, and so we will do everything we can here in the state of Connecticut to protect people, but if they pass a federal abortion ban, we would be impacted.
And there are a lot of conversations, like we saw a few years ago with some of your colleagues, about putting certain protections into place, reprioritizing things to be prepared for an election to go either way, either from president to congressional balance of power. Are you and your colleagues in the state legislature having any of those conversations right now ahead of the November election?
I mean, those conversations have been ongoing, in particular with regards to reproductive health, because we just continue to see how it's rolling out across the country.
Right.
I think for many of us, there's kind of a holding our breath, planning for what we hope to have happen. Which is a Democratic administration, so we can move many of the progressive ideas we have. And then if November should turn out a different way, then we will go into a mode of figuring out what we can do here in the state to protect people.
And I want to talk more specifically now, too, about health. You know, for people who don't know, you've dedicated yourself to creating and carrying out the state's endometriosis working group. You know, something really unique to Connecticut and something that has seen a lot of successes. So tell me about the fight here to ensure women's health isn't dismissed and the necessary resources and research dedicated to it.
Great, yes, thank you. This issue was brought to me and quickly discovered that 1 in 10 individuals with a uterus, primarily women, experience endometriosis, and on average, it takes 10 years to diagnose. Wow. And so here, once again, was an issue that disproportionately impacts women and is often ignored. So formed the endometriosis working group and have been very proud that we were able to fund and start the first of its kind in the nation biorepository that is now collecting samples, tissue samples, with the hope to study how we can have diagnostic tools and treatment, because shockingly, we still don't have diagnostic tools for endometriosis and there's no treatment. And so that connects to the federal policy landscape as well, because women's research at the federal level is underfunded. And so we've actually, the endometriosis working group has met with every member of the Connecticut federal delegation to let them know about our work and tend to push for additional dollars federally.
And in our last minute here, you know, there's definitely a lot of talk about just how new some of these rights, protections, and policies still are for women. You know, that's why you've been digging into this and are writing a book, right? I want you to tell me a little bit about that real quickly.
Yes, I wrote a book, and so it will be out this month, a published book, Feminist Advocacy, Championing Gender and Social Justice. And I think we've done a disservice in this country with how we teach women's history. And so my hope is to fill in some blanks on important legislation that has impacted women's rights, to potentially motivate folks to run for office or to take leadership positions, women, Democratic, progressive women, and to fill in some gaps on what advocacy looks like, having done it now for 20 years.
And last thing here, you know, how does that feel and what was that process like as someone who is, you know, an active state legislator who's working through all of this? Did that kind of shape and change your perspective at all?
Yeah, it helped me to reflect on the various fights and work that I've done over the years, and really just reiterated to me the importance of both culture change and policy change, and that change takes time. So you need to, you know, get in there, invest the time, and be committed to the long game.
Well, Representative Gilchrest, thank you so much. A lot going on, a lot still to come, and I'm sure we'll talk again before the next legislative session, which is slowly creeping up. But thank you so much for taking a couple minutes to be here with us.
Thank you for having me.
There's still more to come here, though, on The Real Story. We're talking immigration, protected legal status, and refugee population. Specifically, what does that look like here in Connecticut, and are there concerns when it comes to changing rhetoric and rising pushback or hate crimes? We're talking with the executive director of IRIS. Stay with us.